Hello, in this video I'm going to continue to the end of chapter 3 of the alleged draft of All My Broken Pieces. So where we had left off, Cindy had been telling us about how her grandson had been knocking on the door of the room that Chris and Shanann were staying in, and Chris had asked her if she could stop him from doing that. So and then the way that had ended was with her asking what's the big deal, and Chris replying that it was Shanann's vacation too, and then Cindy saying I guess, and that was where we had finished. So in the next part she says, anyway, that was the end of it as far as I knew. Something else happened that week which was much worse, but our family doesn't discuss it, and it wasn't between me and Shanann, and Chris didn't hear about it. So I think what she's doing here is she's creating another drama, because she's telling us that something happened that was so bad that she's not even going to tell us what it was. So we're left wondering. And she says it wasn't between her and Shanann. So who was it between? And was it between Shanann and someone? I think that maybe it was, because otherwise, why would it be here? This paragraph, it wouldn't really be relevant to what she's been talking about. I mean, so far what she's describing is her attitude towards Shanann, and she's trying to explain why she feels the way she does about Shanann. So it would make sense that it would have been between Shanann and someone. By saying Chris didn't hear about it, she's telling us, I think, that whatever Chris says, he didn't know about this incident. So we shouldn't really fully trust whatever he says about Shanann and I and our relationship, because he doesn't know the full extent of what happened. I guess of what Shanann was capable of. And it could, this is my interpretation of that paragraph. It could be that she's talking about something completely different, but it would seem strange to me that she would completely change the subject in this paragraph. So I would guess that it has something to do with Shanann again. And from what we know about the last situation she described, which she seems to have made into quite a big deal, we know that wasn't a big deal. At least I think most of us have that impression anyway from reading the comments in the comments section. So I think in the same way we can probably assume that this is not as big as she's trying to make out it is. But I think her intention is to leave us wondering, it must have been something terrible, because we're not even going to hear what it is. And by not telling us, she's also sending us the message that she has so much, she has these values that stop her from telling us, So in other words, having integrity and keeping quiet about things, being sensitive about things, that's much more important to her than spreading gossip. But of course, ironically, what she's doing is she's telling us that something happened, and she's leaving us with this impression that it was something terrible. And so she actually is spreading gossip. And you could argue that it's worse than actually giving us the details, because we can't argue with this sense of that something terrible happened. There's nothing for us to give our own opinion about, or we can't assess what we think about it. So what she is doing is she is actually gossiping, and if she did have these strong values, she just wouldn't be mentioning it at all. The proposal happened during the week as well. Chris and Shanann went down to the beach with the photographer she'd hired, and Chris popped the question and she said yes, and then they posed for pictures that they later showed us. She didn't need to mention that Shanann had been the one to hire the photographer, and I think it's relevant that she does mention that because she's already described Shanann to us and described her actions to us in a way that I think was intending to give us the impression that Shanann was controlling and quite high maintenance and quite demanding. So, and you know, and certainly with her last example of her grandson knocking on the door, I think the impression that we were supposed to be left with was that she was so demanding that came before any kind of empathy. And so I think what she's doing here, by mentioning that Shanann organised these pictures and this photographer, is she's giving us the impression that Shanann was in charge. And we could be left with the impression that Shanann is quite vain. You know, that she's, you know, and that there's something sort of a bit fake about it all, that she's hired this photographer. And you know, that again, this is down to how you interpret what she's written. But we have seen the way that she tries to manipulate us in a really subtle way. And my feeling is that that's what she's doing again now. That she could have said that they'd gone down to the beach with the photographer they'd hired, you know, or with a photographer, or a photographer had come to take photos of them. But instead she says with the photographer she'd hired. Maybe she thought Shanann was vain, or maybe she just thought that she was demanding and that she was controlling. That's certainly the impression that she seems to have been trying to give us so far, that Shanann is so demanding it even comes before empathy for her, because she showed no empathy in Cindy's eyes towards this poor little grandson that she has who was knocking on their door. Then she says, they were in their swimsuits and they looked young and beautiful and happy. Chris was still very slim and muscled then, and so was she, and everyone got a little choked up that there was going to be a wedding, and then we all went home. So that's kind of, it's interesting how she talks about what they look like. Because I would have thought that the important bit was that they were happy, you know. So she says that they looked young and beautiful and happy, but then the rest is just about what they look like, you know, that they were in their swimsuits and how their physiques looked, which is quite superficial, really. And so I think it's quite interesting that that's what Cindy remembers the most. It's not, she mentions that they were happy, but that's almost, that's the third thing she says after saying that they were young and beautiful. So she says that everyone got a little choked up. And then the next thing she says is, and while I wouldn't have said it had gone smoothly, I decided to try and not think about it anymore and just get on with things. So from saying that they were choked up, that they were going to get married, to saying that it had actually all been so terrible that she tried not to even think about it and tried to just get on with things. You know, that's quite strange. That there's something wrong there, because if she was getting choked up, then she was getting emotional about the idea that they were going to be getting married. So then why would she be trying not to think about it? I think it's more realistic that she was trying not to think about it and that she didn't get choked up. And I don't think the two really match. So I think she's giving us a false impression here that she was so happy for them, that she got choked up. And in giving us that impression, of course, she's painting herself again in a really positive light. From what she's told us so far, I don't see any reason why she would have to try to take her mind off things and just get on with things. You know, try not to think about it anymore. I don't see why that would be, because all we know is that Shanann had asked that her grandson didn't wake her in the morning. So why is this such a nightmare that she has to really try not to think about it? I think that this is because of everything that she's projecting onto Shanann at the moment. And I've given examples in the last videos of how she's doing that. And of course, we don't know this terrible big thing that happened, as I think she would want us to think of it. So we don't have all the information, according to Cindy, of everything else that happened. But I think we can pretty much have quite a good picture of what she thinks should be a big deal. And I think we can guess that it probably isn't a big deal, this other thing either. So for Cindy to have to be trying not to think about it and just getting on with things, I think that just shows how much she's skewing things in her mind and making them everything seem really difficult for her. Then I received an email from Shanann that shocked me completely. The gist of it was that she wanted me to know that she did not like me one bit. So she said that was the gist of it. So she's not actually quoting Shanann, and I think, as we know, she tends to exaggerate. So although she's saying the gist of it was that she wanted me to know she didn't like me one bit, I think we have to ask ourselves, is that likely? Would it really make sense that Shanann would have written a letter to her future mother-in-law, to her future mother-in-law, just to let her know that she doesn't like her? It wouldn't really make a lot of sense to behave in that way. So I wonder, especially based on the way that she seems to have skewed things in her mind so far, I wonder if this is again a case of Cindy taking something that Shanann said and transforming it into, I don't like you. She thought I was a bad influence and a bad mother to Chris. Well, she's already said that she thought that what Shanann was saying about Chris in jest, that she felt that this was her telling her that she, that it was her fault because she was Chris's mother. So now we have her saying that Shanann's telling her she's a bad mother, and you have to wonder, well, again, really? Is she really saying that? Or is this what Cindy is taking from it? I do believe her when she said that the email shocked her completely, because we can see how she's already assuming that we as readers are on her side. The way that this is written, the way that the last bit ended with her saying, I guess, it sort of takes into account that we are going to be on her side and she doesn't have to explain anything to us. In terms of her saying that Cindy has been a bad influence on Chris, I can imagine that maybe she was saying something like that, because Chris was very influenced by the people around him. We can see that he is a social chameleon, and that's the nature of a covert narcissist. They behave according to either what they can get away with if they're revealing their true selves, or most of the time they're not actually being genuine. So Cindy did influence Chris a lot. I think, to become the person that he's become. I think the whole reason he wears a mask is because when he was a child, he didn't feel that that he was able, that he had emotional support when he was being himself. That's what makes a narcissist into a narcissist. They don't feel valued for who they really are. They feel valued for something that they can do, and that then becomes part of their mask. They identify with the part of themselves that pleases the narcissistic parent, and it doesn't necessarily reflect their true feelings or who they really are. So in this case, Chris was identifying with the parts of himself that pleased his mother. So she would talk about how he was good at sport, and what a good boy he was. How he was never any trouble, and he became someone who was just what everyone wanted him to be on the surface. So I think with Chris, he was very influenced by his mother, and so Shanann would have been right in feeling that way. And so when Cindy was saying negative things about Shanann, or leaving really obvious hints that she didn't like Shanann, Chris would have probably been affected by that. And he probably shared with Shanann the things that his mother was saying. We know that according to Cindy, he'd shared how she'd reacted to the engagement. So he may well have been sharing other things that his mother had said. I think that would have been stressful for Shanann because of the way that Chris would have been influenced by his mother's opinion. So then she goes on to say, she said she knew I did not like her either, and the less we saw of each other, the better. And I mean, it's hard to comment on that really, because we don't know what Shanann actually said. This time she's saying she said, she's not saying the gist of it was. So who knows? Maybe Shanann said that. Maybe she didn't. If Shanann did suggest that they had space from each other, that maybe they didn't see each other that often, I would have thought from what we do know about Shanann and what we do know about Cindy so far, that Shanann probably would have said it differently from how Cindy's saying it. Rather than that Shanann would have actually said, the less we see of each other, the better. I'd never said an unkind word to her. I felt like I'd bent over backwards to welcome her into our family. And I also thought, wrongly, obviously, that I had hidden my doubts about her. So it doesn't seem that she's bent over backwards to welcome her into her family, because she didn't even congratulate them on getting engaged. And, with this issue with her grandson waking them, she didn't try to do anything about that. In fact, she got annoyed that Shanann had even asked for that. So it doesn't really seem like she's been bending over backwards to welcome Shanann. And she's also said at the beginning, she's said that she would just not give her opinion about Shanann. So that would have been really obvious. I mean, if your mother doesn't give her opinion at all on the person you're going to marry, then there's going to be an obvious elephant in the room. And then she said that she thought wrongly, obviously, that I'd hidden my doubts about her. But again, well, not only would this have been very much not hiding anything, but also she was saying that she had made it clear that she didn't like the way she spoke about Chris, that she'd made it clear to Shanann. So again, she wasn't hiding her doubts about that. I think that some of this is what Cindy actually means, because she's already shown us that she's really unaware of how people will perceive the things she says. And this is because she lacks empathy. Because she can't empathise with people, in my opinion, she's struggling to understand how they're going to view her and how they're going to respond to the things that she's saying. She's just assuming that they're going to see things her way. So I think that she probably would have been surprised, at least to some degree, and because she would have been feeling like she was doing such a massive favour to Chris to not express more of her judgment about Shanann. So I think she would have been wrapped up in what a huge sacrifice that was, and would have been expecting that to be really appreciated, and that it would have thrown her to that somebody wasn't appreciating it and was actually annoyed by it. It would have been a lie to say I wasn't completely devastated by that email. In my whole life, no one had ever said anything like that to me. I think that's really unlikely, because everybody gets judged. You know, the nicest, kindest people get judged. And to have reached Cindy's age and for no one to ever have said that they don't like her, which I would be really, really surprised if Shanann had actually said. But anyway, according to her, that's what she'd said. So even if it was that drastic and Shanann had said that, I'm sure that at some point in Cindy's life, other people had expressed that they didn't like her. So I think this is a case of Cindy saying, you are the only one to see me in this way. And she's telling us she's the only one who's ever seen me in this way. And that's a tactic that a narcissist uses to disqualify what you say, to tell you that it's meaningless because nobody agrees with you. And so on the one hand, she's telling us not to believe Shanann, but on the other hand, she's telling us how horrible Shanann is, I think, that she's saying this, that she's saying how horrible Shanann is to have said this when no one else had ever done anything so horrible. So in other words, we should think even more of how horrible this was of Shanann. And also that we should think that Cindy's an incredibly nice person because no one's ever expressed that they don't like her. Like Chris, I'm shy. I don't get into arguments with people or raise my voice. I cried and I showed it to Ronnie, who told me not to answer and to just forget about it. My husband really can do things like that. I didn't take his advice. I wish I had now, because what does any of it matter anymore? It did then though, and then is what I'm having to remember now. So saying, like Chris, I'm shy. First of all, she's saying that, you know, you can include Chris in this bracket. You know, so she's defending Chris, I think, at the same time as defending herself. And she's saying, I didn't get into arguments with people or raise my voice. So in other words, I think what she's saying is that I'm not an aggressive person at all. I'm a shy person. So, and I don't even raise my voice at people. So I'm very much the victim here. And Chris is the same as me. He's like that as well. So in other words, you know, we shouldn't think of him as, he's not an aggressive person. He's not the aggressor. And it, you know, so that's not who he is at heart anyway. And I think she's preparing us that it wasn't Chris's fault what happened, you know, the murder of his family. And she's also defending herself and putting herself across as an innocent victim who's completely harmless and just wouldn't hurt people, would never be aggressive towards people. And to say I'm shy, it's almost saying that she doesn't even have the confidence to be aggressive towards anyone. Then she says, I cried. So again, she wants us to know that she cried, that she was really upset by this letter, and that she was really feeling vulnerable after reading it, so that we can empathise with her and see her as the victim. And then when she says she showed it to Ronnie, who told her not to answer and just to forget about it. Well, I think that makes sense. I can imagine that that's true. I think Ronnie was the enabler in that situation and probably still is. He enables her behaviour and supports her. My husband really can do things like that. In other words, I can't. So my husband could have forgotten about it, but I can't because it really affected me. And I think that a sign of her not being able to handle criticism is what she makes a situation into. I've said I think it's unlikely that Shanann would have said she didn't like her. And, I do. I think from everything we know about Shanann, I don't personally imagine that she would have said that. But I think the fact that Cindy doesn't even say that she said that. She says that was the gist of what she said. And I think that the fact that she's made it into her being accused of being a bad mother and being told that Shanann doesn't like her is a sign of her sensitivity to criticism. Whatever Shanann did say, which was probably that she was very hurt and upset with her, I would guess, that she might have said something like that, that would have felt to Cindy exactly the same as if she'd said that she didn't like her and that she was a bad mother. So then when she says, I didn't take his advice, I wish I had now, because what does any of it matter anymore? It did then though, and then is what I'm having to remember now. So she had no choice in it, is what I think she's trying to put across. And this was such a hurtful experience that she didn't feel she had any choice. She had to respond, even though she regrets it. But she doesn't regret it because she was overreacting or she wasn't taking into account where Shanann was coming from. She just regrets it because, as she said, what does any of it matter? By saying it mattered then though, and this is what I'm having to remember now, she's again painting herself as the victim, and the victim of Shanann, because even though she says that now it doesn't matter, she's saying it did matter then. She was hurt by Shanann then. Now she's having to remember this because Shanann has been murdered. And so now Cindy is having to remember how much Shanann hurt her. I wrote her back. I told her how badly she'd hurt my feelings. I told her that whether it looked like it or not, that I was trying. I told her that I didn't like the way she talked about my son or how she'd acted with my grandson, but that at least I was making an effort. So that suggests to me, and I'm not completely sure actually, but I think what she may be saying is that Shanann wasn't making an effort when she says at least I was making an effort. And when she says, I told her how badly she'd hurt my feelings, she's again giving all the responsibility to Shanann. She's not saying I'm hurt. She's saying, look, you have hurt my feelings really badly. So, you've really done something here to me. But you don't hear her ever talking about whether she may have hurt Shanann's feelings or taking any responsibility for that. And then when she says, I told her that whether it looked like it or not, I was trying. Well, if it didn't look like it, then she wouldn't have been trying in a very productive way. Because if she was trying in a way that she would be proud of acknowledging, then that would be clear to somebody that she was trying. So if you're going to say, well, I tried to make you welcome, even if it doesn't show, well, then that sort of doesn't make much sense, does it? Because if it doesn't show, then you shouldn't be really thanked for it, because you haven't done a very good job of it. But again, she doesn't acknowledge that. She doesn't acknowledge responsibility for actually making Shanann feel welcome in an obvious way, that where it should look like she was trying. And then she says, when she says, I told her I didn't like the way she talked about my son. Well, she's already told us about that, and she's already told us that she's made it clear already to Shanann. So that means she would have been repeating that when she knew that Shanann already knew that she felt that way, because she's told us she'd already made it obvious. So why would she repeat it? It seems like she was just coming back at Shanann. She'd found something to throw at Shanann, and she was throwing it at her, even though she'd already covered that subject with her. And she told her and how she'd acted with my grandson. Well, all we know is that she'd asked that he didn't wake her. So to say that you don't like the way that someone acts with your grandson, I mean, that implies something so much worse, doesn't it? So either she's really exaggerating the fact that Shanann didn't want to be woken by him, or this mystery event that happened had something to do with her grandson, in which case she's telling us that now, and she's revealing even more of this secret that she supposedly is keeping hidden because of her strong values. Then I think I told her that I wouldn't have ever written an email like this if I hadn't gotten hers. So, I mean, I guess my response to that is it just sounds very childish. Again, she's throwing all the responsibility at Shanann. Or she's pretty much saying, you have made me write an email like this. And the fact that she's saying that she wouldn't have ever written an email like this suggests that it was quite a rude email. Otherwise, why would she need to explain it? So that means that probably there's a lot more that she wrote that she's not telling us about. And it all seems so stupid and petty now. And it was then ugly and petty and as sorry a beginning as a family trying to blend could have. So again, I get the sense that she's probably said more in that letter than she's admitting to. I didn't say anything to Chris though, because they'd just gotten engaged and it would have upset him. And Ronnie said not to, and he was probably right. So she didn't say anything to Chris, but she wrote this letter to Shanann, and presumably Shanann is going to share that with Chris. So I think what she's doing, I mean, I don't think that she would be so stupid as to not know that. So I think what she's doing is she's just trying to get credit from us, the reader. I think she's underestimating our intelligence, and that she's thinking that we're going to think that that was a very kind sacrifice she made to not say anything to Chris. But if she was concerned about upsetting Chris because he'd just got engaged, as she says that she was, then she wouldn't have sent that letter to Shanann, because obviously it's very likely that Chris is going to hear about it. So I think it's another way of trying to manipulate us into giving her credit, thinking really well of her, and another way to paint herself as this very kind, thoughtful lady. And again, a very good mother for considering her son's feelings. I don't know what I thought would happen, but what I wanted to happen was for it to go away and not to ever have her or anyone really be as mean to me as that again, or make me lose my temper as I had. So all she sees of Shanann's letter, she sees Shanann's letter as being really mean to her. That Shanann's sole intention in writing this letter was to try to be really mean to her future mother-in-law. And I, again, from what we know of Shanann, I'd be surprised. It would make more sense to me that Shanann had been expressing what had hurt her, and what she didn't want to see any more of. But Cindy cannot imagine what it was like from Shanann's perspective. She's not interested in even considering that. All she's focused on is the idea that she now has an enemy. There's somebody who's not on her side, who's being really mean to her. And that makes me think of a little girl, you know, who's come home from her primary school, who's, you know, maybe a small 5-year-old girl who's been bullied, and her best friend has suddenly turned against her and been mean to her. And when she says, or made me lose my temper as I had, again, Shanann was making her lose her temper. So she has no responsibility for her own emotions or for her own mood or for her own behaviour, because losing your temper, that's your behaviour. It's not just how you feel inside. So she's blaming Shanann for that as well. And I say it sounds like a little girl. I think that does as well. And a narcissist does come across as a child because the development, the emotional development of a narcissist is stunted, and they split off from themselves when they were still children. And so where often narcissists do come across as very childlike, and that's the reason why, because they've never learned to develop emotionally, to handle their own emotions and to take responsibility for them. And of course, Cindy is again unaware of how this is coming across to us. And then she says, I couldn't deal with things like this, and up until then I'd never had to. And she'd never in her whole life ever had to deal with anything like this. I find that incredibly unlikely. So again, she's painting herself as this victim. She's making Shanann's behaviour much bigger than whatever it would have been, because even if Shanann had said what she's saying, that this still is a big overreaction to it, because she's suggesting that Shanann did something to her that no one had ever done before in all of her life. So she's blowing it up. I decided to turn the other cheek and try harder. This, as it happens, was not a very good plan either. So she's mentioning something from the Bible here, something that Jesus advised people do, to turn the other cheek. And again, painting herself as someone who was, you know, so well-meaning and humble. Her ego wasn't an issue. She was prepared to just turn the other cheek, and to try harder. So I think that again, she wants a lot of credit from us, but she's already shown us that that's not who she is, that she doesn't turn the other cheek. She fights back, and she gives as good as she thinks she's getting, which in my experience and in my opinion of Cindy, is not anything like as bad as she thinks it is. So in other words, the way she reacts is always going to be much more harsh than the way somebody else has just behaved towards her, because she skews it. You know, in her mind, she sees it as having much more malice than it does. So I'm going to leave it here. In the next video, I'm going to be looking at some of the arguments people have for why they think Chris Watts isn't a narcissist, and I'll be giving my opinion on those. So if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.